What if the history you were taught in school left out the darkest parts? Imagine a time when a mother would break her own daughter's feet just to make her beautiful. Or when families posed for portraits with their dead loved ones. These aren't scenes from a horror movie. They were real. Today, we're digging up 5 historical practices so disturbing, you'll wonder how they were ever considered normal. History isn't just dates and famous battles. It's full of strange and unsettling human behavior. And when you step off the path of sanitized textbook stories, you find traditions that are profoundly shocking to us now. These practices are windows into the beliefs, fears, and social pressures that shaped entire civilizations, showing us how ideas of justice, beauty, and grief could go in directions that now seem totally alien. So get ready. We're about to explore a world where pain was an art form, death was a photo op, and survival sometimes came at a cost worse than death itself. If you're fascinated by the strange corners of the past, make sure you subscribe, because we're always digging up something new. Now, let's get into it. Coming in at number 5 is a form of execution so infamous, its name alone means slow, agonizing torment. Lingchi, or death by 1,000 cuts. This wasn't a quick ending. It was a public performance of state-sponsored brutality, designed for maximum physical pain and public humiliation. For centuries, up until it was abolished in 1905, Lingchi was the punishment for the worst crimes in imperial China. Things like high treason or murdering one's parents. The honor of Lingchi was multi-layered. First, it was a public show. The condemned was tied to a post in a town square where crowds, including children, would gather to watch. This was meant to be a terrifying lesson for everyone. An executioner with a sharp knife would then begin the slow process. While some sensational accounts claim there could be as many as 3,000 cuts, the goal was always the same: to prolong the ordeal by methodically removing parts of the body. The descriptions are pure nightmare fuel. The executioner would start with cuts on the chest, arms, and thighs. Then, extremities like fingers, toes, and ears might be removed one by one before the limbs themselves were severed. The executioner had to be careful not to let the victim die too quickly. Opium was sometimes given, not just as mercy, but to keep the condemned conscious through the torment. For the wealthy, there was a grim loophole. Families could sometimes bribe the executioner to make a fatal stab to the heart early on. One famous case was the execution of Yuan Chongwan, a Ming Dynasty general, in 1630. Falsely accused of treason, he was sentenced to this excruciating death. Another legendary tale involves Liu Jin, a corrupt eunuch from 1510. It's said his execution took 3 days, with over 3,000 cuts, and that he was fed after the first day just to keep him alive for the next. Whether these stories are entirely factual or were exaggerated over time, they show the psychological terror Lingchi was meant to create. But the physical torture was only part of it. Lingchi was also designed for spiritual ruin. In traditional Confucian belief, the body was a sacred gift from one's parents, and to mutilate it was a profound act of disrespect to your ancestors. It was thought that a dismembered body could not find peace in the afterlife. This loss of somatic integrity was often seen as a punishment worse than death, extending the shame beyond the grave. The end of Lingchi came in the early 20th century, partly due to outside pressure. In 1904 and 1905, French soldiers in Beijing photographed 2 Lingchi executions. These graphic images spread through the West, sparking an outcry and solidifying an image of China as barbaric. Facing this condemnation and calls for reform at home, the Qing government officially abolished the practice on April 24, 1905. It was a stark end to a centuries-old practice that shows how justice, in some eras, was about the complete annihilation of a person, body, and soul. At number 4, we have a practice inflicted within the family. A beauty ritual so extreme, it crippled generations of women for about 1,000 years. This was Chinese foot binding, the custom of breaking and binding the feet of young girls to create tiny, pointed lotus feet. From around the 10th century until the early 20th century, this wasn't seen as malicious, but as a crucial part of culture, social status, and a tyrannical standard of beauty. The process usually began when a girl was between 4 and 8 years old, when her bones were still soft. It was almost always done by her mother or another female relative. The procedure was agonizing. First, the feet were soaked in a warm mixture of herbs and sometimes animal blood to soften them. Then, the 4 smaller toes on each foot were curled under and pressed down with immense force until the bones snapped. The arch was then broken, and the entire front of the foot was pulled towards the heel. Finally, long silk or cotton bandages were wrapped tightly to hold the broken pieces in a triangular shape. This was just the start of a lifetime of pain. Every few days, the bindings were removed, the feet were cleaned of pus and blood, and rotting flesh was cut away. The girl would then be forced to walk on her broken feet to further crush the arch. The goal was the golden lotus, a foot just 3 inches long. A 4-inch foot was a silver lotus, but anything larger was an iron lotus, a failure that could ruin a girl's marriage prospects. Women with bound feet suffered from chronic infections and mobility issues, forcing them into a swaying walk known as the lotus gait. So why would anyone do this? The practice is thought to have started with a 10th century court dancer who entranced an emperor. It then spread through nearly all social classes. By the 19th century, it's estimated that 40 to 50% of all Chinese women and nearly 100% of upper-class Han women had bound feet. Its popularity came down to status, marriage, and what was considered erotic. Bound feet were a symbol of wealth. It showed a family was rich enough that its women didn't need to do physical labor. For poorer families, it was an investment, a way for a daughter to marry into a wealthier family. Beyond status, bound feet were seen as the height of beauty and held a powerful erotic appeal. The teetering lotus gait was considered incredibly alluring. The feet themselves were seen as the most intimate part of a woman's body, always hidden in embroidered lotus shoes. It literally confined women to the home, reinforcing Confucian ideals of female subservience. Opposition grew in the 19th century, led by Christian missionaries and Chinese reformers. The Manchu emperors of the Qing dynasty had tried to ban it in the 17th century but failed, and many historians argue this is because it had become a core part of Han Chinese identity. After the Qing dynasty fell, the new Republic of China outlawed the practice in 1912. However, it stubbornly persisted in rural areas for decades, only truly ending after 1949. Today, those tiny lotus shoes in museums are a haunting reminder of a beauty standard that demanded a lifetime of agony. For our third entry, we head out to the high seas during the Age of Sail. Life on a ship was brutal, and discipline was absolute. Of all the punishments a captain could use, none was more feared than keelhauling. The name comes from the Dutch Keelhauling, meaning to drag along the keel, and that's exactly what it was. Keelhauling was a method of torture and execution practiced by some European navies, most notably the Dutch. From the 16th century until it was abolished in 1853. While we often think of pirates doing this, it was a documented punishment in official naval forces for serious crimes like mutiny or cowardice. The goal wasn't always to kill the sailor, though that happened a lot. The point was to inflict maximum suffering and terrify the rest of the crew into obedience. The process was sadistically simple. The sailor was tied to a rope looped underneath the ship. Weights, like cannonballs, were tied to his legs to make sure he'd sink. The whole crew was forced to watch. Once ready, he was thrown overboard. The crew would then haul on the rope, pulling him down one side of the ship, under the hull, and up the other. This was a gauntlet of horrors. First, there was drowning. Some accounts mention the Dutch would shove an oil-soaked sponge in the victim's mouth, supposedly to give him a bit of air, but more likely to stop him from drowning too quickly. The real agony, though, came from the hull itself. After months at sea, a ship's bottom was covered in sharp, jagged barnacles. As the sailor was dragged across, his skin and flesh would be shredded. If he was lucky, he'd only get severe cuts. If he was unlucky, he could lose an eye or even be decapitated by the keel or rudder. And all that blood in the water attracted sharks. If the sailor survived one pass, the captain could order another. The mangled victim would be hoisted up, gasping, only to be dropped back in for another go. The practice was so brutal that a London journalist who claimed to have witnessed a version of it near Alexandria in 1882, a late and controversial report, said it was so revoltingly cruel, so infamously brutal, that he couldn't even write about it. Keelhauling stands as a terrifying example of how absolute power in the isolated world of the sea could create a form of justice that was pure, calculated torture. Number 2 on our list isn't physically brutal, but it's psychologically unsettling in a way that's hard to shake. This is the Victorian tradition of post-mortem photography, taking formal portraits of people after they had died. This wasn't some morbid fringe hobby. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, It was a common and cherished way for families to remember their loved ones. To understand why, you have to remember that death was everywhere in the Victorian era. Child mortality rates were sky high, and diseases like cholera and tuberculosis were rampant. Unlike today, where death is hidden away in hospitals, it usually happened at home, surrounded by family. This constant presence of death created a different way of grieving. At the same time, photography was new and expensive. For many working-class families, the death of a child might be the first and only opportunity to get a photograph. It became a precious and sometimes the only visual memento they would ever have of that person. What makes these photos so creepy to us is the effort made to make the dead look alive. This wasn't about documenting death. It was about preserving an illusion of life. A common style was the last sleep, where a deceased child was posed as if napping, often surrounded by their toys or held by their mother. Even more unsettling were the photos where the deceased was posed sitting up or even standing, held in place by hidden props. The family would pose alongside them for a full portrait, where one member just happened to be dead. A clue is often the focus. The deceased person is perfectly sharp because they didn't move during the long exposure, while the living members might be slightly blurry. To enhance the illusion, photographers would sometimes tint the cheeks of the deceased with a rosy color. In some of the most unnerving examples, they would even paint open eyes onto the closed eyelids of the subject, making it look like they were awake and staring right at you. These photos weren't considered morbid at the time. They were treasured keepsakes, a tangible link to a lost family member. For grieving Victorians, these images were a way to deny the finality of death, to hold onto one last moment. The practice faded in the early 20th century as photography got cheaper, allowing people to take pictures of their loved ones while they were still alive. As our relationship with death changed, post-mortem photography went from a comforting ritual to a macabre relic of a bygone era. And finally, at number 1, a practice born not of cruelty, but of desperate necessity. This is the grim reality of surgical amputations during the American Civil War. Between 1861 and 1865, surgeons performed an estimated 60,000 amputations, making it the most common operation of the war. This has led to the image of Civil War surgeons as sawbones and butchers, hacking off limbs. But the truth is more complex and, in its own way, more terrifying. They weren't ignorant. They were making a grim calculation to save a life. The main reason for all these amputations was a new type of bullet, the Minié ball. This heavy lead bullet flattened on impact, shattering bone into fragments, tearing through muscle, and dragging dirt and clothing deep into the wound. A medical textbook of the time said the effects were truly terrible. Doctors simply couldn't fix this kind of damage. The shattered bone couldn't be set, and the massive, dirty wound was a breeding ground for deadly infections like gangrene. So, surgeons faced a horrible choice: amputate or watch the soldier die a slow, agonizing death. Amputation wasn't the last resort. It was often the only option. Field hospitals were set up in barns, churches, or tents. Operating tables were often just doors laid across barrels. And while anesthesia like chloroform and ether was used in the vast majority of cases, nothing was sterile. The concept of germs wasn't understood yet. A surgeon might use the same unwashed hands and instruments on patient after patient, wiping them on a dirty apron. This meant that even if you survived the surgery, you could easily die from an infection afterward. The procedure itself was a display of brutal efficiency. A skilled surgeon could amputate a limb in under 10 minutes. They'd apply a tourniquet, cut through the skin and muscle with knives, and then an assistant would pull the flesh back to expose the bone. Then came the most infamous tool, the bone saw. The sound of it cutting through bone became a symbol of the field hospital's horror. The surgeon would tie off the arteries, smooth the bone, and pull a flap of skin over the stump. The severed limb would then be tossed onto a growing pile outside the tent, a sight that cemented the butcher reputation of the doctors. But despite how gruesome it was, amputation saved lives. The survival rate for an amputation done within 48 hours of injury was around 75%. While we see it as barbaric, it was a desperate but effective response to an unprecedented level of carnage. It was a practice that left a generation of men scarred, a haunting testament to the brutal realities of a war that pushed medicine to its absolute limits. From the calculated cruelty of Lingchi to the desperate measures of a civil war operating tent, these practices force us to see the past differently. They show us that what one culture finds beautiful, another sees as mutilation. What one era calls justice, another calls torture. As shocking as they are to us, these customs were once a normal part of life. So, what do you think? Which of these practices shocked you the most? Is there another creepy custom that you think should have been on this list? Let us know in the comments below. We read all of them. And if you enjoyed this trip into the darker side of history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories they didn't teach you in school. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.